Good afternoon. My name is Rubenstein, and I'm the Director of Education for International March of the Living. And it is my privilege to present you this lecture on behalf of the Two Museums program. The topic of today's lecture is the upstanders, the righteous among the nations who saved Jewish life during the Holocaust. And throughout the next few minutes, I'm going to tell you some stories about these righteous among the nations. And why is it so important to do that? First of all, because it happened. Stories I'm telling you are part of the historical record. Secondly, because these incredibly righteous people deserve to be honored. And thirdly, because in some way, in some small way in our own lives, we need to try to emulate their behavior and stand up against injustice. And fourthly, this is especially important when it comes to teaching young people. When we teach the history of the Holocaust, we do not want to create a generation of misanthropes. We want people to understand that there's also goodness to humanity. Because if the righteous among the nations did not exist during the Holocaust, we would just have to give up and leave this planet. So these are the reasons why I feel it's so important to share the stories of the righteous among the nations during the Holocaust. In the first story, a woman gets on a train. She sits down and she sees a man sitting next to him. And they don't exchange words until all of a sudden the train stops. And the woman becomes very nervous because the Nazis are coming on board to look for papers. And she starts to cry. And the man says, "Why are you crying?" She says, "You know why I'm crying? I don't have any papers. The Nazis catch me, my life is over." Hoping that this man would somehow help her. But instead, the next moment, he starts to scream at her, "You fool! You idiot! What is wrong with you?" The woman says, "Oh, why did I trust this man?" The Nazi comes over. "What's all the screaming about? What's all the yelling about?" The man says, "What's all the yelling about? What's all the screaming about? I'll tell you what it's all about. I'm a proud citizen of this country. And here are my papers." And this idiot sitting next to me, this foolish woman, you want to know where her papers are? Where's her glasses? Where's her purse? Where's her keys? Where's her this? Where's that? My idiot wife's brought her papers again. You know how difficult to live with this woman? And I just sit down. I want order. So remember next time, sit down. Don't make a scene. The Nazi gets off the train. The train continues to the next station. And then the man gets off. She never even finds out his name. But in a split second, he not only the more courage, but the moral imagination to save her life. Beautiful story. And this person didn't have to think about what he did instinctively. He took the steps to save this woman's life. Very similar story happens in the ghetto of Chernovitz. Every day, a little girl, a Jewish girl, would smuggle herself out of Chernovitz, the ghetto of Chernovitz, to the main town and get food for her family. Why could she do that? Because she's small enough to get through the cracks and she didn't look Jewish. But one day, a Nazi soldier catches her. Doesn't realize she's Jewish, but is wondering why a little 8-year-old girl is running around the streets of Chernovitz unsupervised. "Little girl, where do you live?" Oh, no, I'll take you home. No, I'll go myself. "Where do you live?" She can't tell him where she lives. She lives in the ghetto. If he finds out, death penalty for her and perhaps her entire family. "I live over there." She points to a house a block away from the ghetto wall. "I will take you there." And he grabs her by the hand. They climb the steps and they knock on the door. And the door happens to belong to the home of a famous opera singer. And there's no answer. And the girl heaves a sigh of relief. And then the door opens up. There's the opera singer standing there. There's the Nazi and the little girl. And before the opera singer can say anything, because she's puzzled what's going on, the Nazi says, "I found your girl walking around the streets of Chernovitz. Is anybody taking care of her child? What kind of mother are you?" Instinctively, the opera singer grabs the girl, smacks her across the face, and looks at the Nazi and says, "I'm so sorry. I must discipline my child. Thank you for your kindness. Have a good night." Closes the door, looks at the girl and says, "You're a Jewish girl, aren't you?" And saved her life. Again, the same story. Instinctively, without a moment's notice, she knew the right thing to do. What a level of goodness and level of kindness. I'm reminded of the story of Max Eisen, Holocaust survivor from Toronto, originally from area near Czechoslovakia. And he was an exceptionally difficult story, but I'm going to come to the end of his story when he was on a death march and then he was put on a train And the train in the middle of January had no roof, just had sides. And if you touched the steel and you didn't move it around quickly enough, quick enough, your hand would freeze to the steel. And they're in terrible shape. They're in ragged clothing. And after the death march and after being on this train, which was a cold train, he felt there was no decent people left alive. People were dying like flies left and right. And the train arrives in the town of Pilsen, middle of the night. And then they're under a bridge and the sun comes up. And Max looks up and sees all these people, Czech citizens, gather around the bridge. And they're throwing loaves of bread to the starving prisoners below. And the Nazis says, stop, or we're going to shoot. Then they keep throwing the bread. The Nazis start shooting, and then the people scatter. And Max says, I had no chance of getting any of that bread. But that moment was so beautiful for me because it showed me there were still decent people left alive. It was like a hand reaching out during those dark years to show me that humanity still existed. I remember coming across a story of a righteous man in the Netherlands who saved a Jewish family's life. And one of his neighbors knew he was doing this. And he went over and said, listen, I'm not criticizing you for doing it, but how do you take strangers in and risk your own family's life? Like, what's your calculation? What's your rationale for that? The man just walked away from him. And he said to himself, my neighbor has a good point. Where do I have the right to risk my family's life? And he went for a walk on the beach. And all of a sudden, like a bolt of lightning out of the sky, he realized to do anything but save this Jewish family would have been the wrong thing to do. He knew he had to do the right thing, which was save this Jewish family, regardless of the consequences, from the deepest part of his soul. I'm reminded of the stories of Zbigniew Mankowski, who was a little boy living in Warsaw during the Holocaust. And like in one of my previous stories, he was living near the ghetto wall. And one day, with his mother, they see two pails on the porch magically appear. And he goes to his mother and says, where do those pails come from? And his mother says, these are little boys from the Warsaw ghetto who are starving and going to get food for their family. And so they put the pails there for us to put food in. Are we going to? We don't have food ourselves. We are going to, because they're in much worse shape than us. And that's what she did. She stuffed it with some potatoes and some bread. And then Zbigniew waited, and all of a sudden 2 little boys darted out and grabbed the pails, but didn't eat it because they were bringing it back to their family in the ghetto of Warsaw. And this went on for weeks, perhaps even months. Every day, they would put the pails out, the empty pails. His mother would fill it up. They would exchange glances, and Zbigniew never said a word to these 2 Jewish children, but it's like they became friends. And then one day, they stopped coming. Now was the day when the Warsaw ghetto went up in flames. And Zbigniew still remembers to this day seeing tattered pieces of burned paper with Hebrew writing on it, the shattered embers of the destruction of the Warsaw ghetto. Many years later, Zbigniew and his family were awarded the title of Righteous Among the Nations. And his family actually saved other Jews as well, I should say. And he spoke to our group of students and he held the medal and he said, when I went to Yad Vashem in Israel and I received this award, I was thinking of my family. I was thinking of my parents. But I was also thinking of those 2 little Jewish children because they were heroes too. They were heroes too. So again, the actions of the righteous among the nations not only inspire us by what they did, but how they felt about themselves. And instead of saying, I'm honored to receive this award, he was thinking about others, anybody but himself. I want to take you to Greece during the war. There are many, many islands in the Mediterranean Sea belonging to Greece. And in some of those islands, the population of the island had 1 Jewish person. And the Nazis specifically would send a boat to that island with that 1 Jewish person to take him off the island to murder him. That's how incredibly demonic they were in their pursuit of all Jews. And most of those Jews perish. But there's one island called Zakynthos where every single Jew was saved. 270 people were not deported because of the heroic action of the mayor, Lucas Carrar, and Bishop Christosomos. When the order came to the deportation, they made sure all the Jews were hidden. And when the Nazis asked for the list of all the Jews living in the towns, they gave them a list which contained only 2 names: Bishop Christosomos and Mayor Lucas Carrar. all of the Jews of the island of Zakynthos were saved. Let's go to the country of Bulgaria, where almost all the Jews of Bulgaria, with some exceptions I should say, were saved because of the heroic actions of the Bulgarian government. And specifically two people, Metropolitan Stefan and Metropolitan Kirill. Metropolitan Stefan was the head of the Sophian Church, and Metropolitan Kirill was the head of the church in the Bulgarian city of Plovdiv. And when the Nazis came to deport the Jews, and they had them gathered up for deportation, he threatened to lie down the railroad tracks rather than let the train take the Jews out of the town. And when they were assembled in a school, he went there, and the guard said, "You can't go there." And he said, "Try to stop me." And he jumped over the gate, and he stood with the Jews who flocked around him, and he said, "Wherever you go, I will go. Asher telchi alech, wherever you go, I go," which is a famous words from the book of Ruth, when Ruth and Naomi are talking about what's going to happen next. And when Naomi tries to convince Ruth to go back to her hometown, and Ruth says to Naomi, "No, wherever you go, I go. Your people are my people. Your God is my God. Wherever you will go, I will go." And that's what this beautiful Christian man said, and saved the Jews of that town, as were most of Bulgarian Jews saved during the Holocaust. In another story, there was a man by the name of Yoshka Indig who had Jewish orphans with him that he'd rescued from various places with him in the town of Nonantola, Italy. And for a while, things were fine. He made friends with the local people there, and the Italians were not as viciously anti-Semitic as the Nazis for the most part, and they turned a blind eye to what was going on. But one day, the local police chief comes and says, "Listen, the Nazis are coming in full force tomorrow, and the Germans, they will not turn a blind eye. You better take your orphans, Jewish boys and girls, and hide them somewhere." "Where shall I hide them?" "I don't know. But you better hide them, otherwise they'll all be murdered." Luckily, Yoshka was good friends with the local abbot. He goes to the local abbot and says, "Please, will you take my children?" You know what the local abbot says? "You have children, boys and girls? I will take the boys." Yoshka said, "What about the girls? They want to live too." The abbot says, "Please, stop. A woman has never set foot in this monastery, and I'm going to break tradition? I'm going to violate what my bishop wanted, my pope would want, by taking in teenage girls? I can't even think of that. I will save the boys, but I cannot save the girls." Yoshka looks at the abbot and realizes whatever he says next will make the difference for the lives of these girls. And he looks at him and says, "I know about your tradition. I know what your bishop would want. I know what your pope would want. But please, stop for a second. Ask yourself, what would your God want? What would your God want?" And a moment later, the abbot breaks out in peals of laughter and says, of course, I'll save the girls. You're right, I'll save the girls too." And all those lives were saved, Jewish boys and girls, all orphans, and eventually they moved to the land of Israel. In Albania, the only country in Europe where there were more Jews after the war than before the war. And that's because Albania protected all of its Jews and protected any Jews who sought refuge from other countries inside of Albania. And incidentally, Albania was the only Muslim country during the Second World War that the Nazis occupied in Europe. And one of the tragic stories, which just shows you the kind of heroism, but also the tragedy of the Holocaust, was where an Albanian family was hiding a Jewish boy in their home. The Nazis came and he said, "Well, you know, there's a Jewish boy here." And two boys came out. "Which one of you is Jewish?" And many times, the way to determine who was Jewish was through circumcision. But since the Albanian were Muslims, they also circumcised their children. There was no way to determine which of the boy was Jewish. And the father looks at the two children and says to his own son, "Now is the time to show what we're made of." And so what happens was, his son steps forward and says, "I'm Jewish." And that Nazi executes that boy. Tremendously tragic story, but again, showing you the heroism of some people during the Holocaust. One of the most famous stories of recent times that we've come across is that of Nicholas Winton. Nicholas Winton saved 669 Jewish children from Czechoslovakia before the war as part of the kinder transport. And for many years, very few people knew about this, including his own wife. And one day, his wife is searching through the attic and comes across the pictures of all these children that he has saved. And she said, "What is this? Why did I know about this?" And Nicholas Winton said, "Not everything a husband does, his wife must know about." And some years later, Nicholas Winton was invited to a studio in BBC. And he didn't know what was going on, but he's sitting in the audience, and the producer of the show says, Mr. Winton, you know the person sitting next to you to your right? No. She stands up. I was one of the children you saved all those decades ago. Do you know the person sitting to your left? And the man stands up. I was one of the persons. He didn't know anybody in the studio. Turns out every single person in the studio audience were people he had saved some many decades ago. This is a story of an incredibly righteous person, Nicholas Winton, saving 669 souls, and for many years, most of the world never even heard about it. In the town of Rokitno, a rabbi and his son are hiding from the Nazis. And nearby there's a monastery. And the Polish priests know that he's there, but he refuses to come out. And then his son dies, and he has basically given up on life. And every day the Polish priests go by, and they sing in Polish. The Nazis don't understand it. Rabbi, we know you're in the forest, please come out and we will help you. But he wasn't sure to trust them, because you never knew who was going to be your enemy, who your friend would be. You know what happened? At that point in time, when his son died, he could care less. He'd given hope on life. Whatever happens, happens. He came out of the forest. The Polish priest jumped on him, grabbed him, pulled one of their garb over him, and said to him, Rabbi, you are Jewish and we are Christian, but you are like one of our own. We will save you because you are a holy man. And they saved his life. And I will say to you, when those Christian priests from that monastery were singing that song to the rabbi, no one has ever heard more beautiful music than the music and the words that came off the lips of those priests. During the Holocaust, a Polish family hears a knock on the door in the middle of the night. They open the door, there's a Jewish man standing here. Please, the Nazis are chasing us. Take us in. Please take us in. He looks at his wife. We have barely anything to give them. What are we going to do? Okay, stay in the barn for the night. You'll go first thing in the morning. The morning comes, the Jew's about to leave with his family, and then Polish farmer says, listen, my wife and I discussed this. You stay. We know what will happen if you leave. You will not survive for a day. Stay as long as you need to stay. And that's what happens. Stays for months, they actually become good friends, until one day, by complete accident, the Polish farmer discovers the Jewish man and his family about to leave. What's going on, he says. Why are you leaving? Haven't I been good to you? The Jewish man says, no, that's the problem. You've been too good to us. Because we discovered what happened in the neighboring Polish village to a Polish family who's hiding a Jewish family. The Nazis caught them, not only executed the Jewish family, they executed the entire Polish family, hanging side to the neck, saying, this is what we do to people who save Jews. And you've been so good to us, we cannot possibly repay good with evil. We are leaving. And for the first time, the Polish farmer becomes angry and says to the Jewish man, listen to me and listen to me carefully. Put down your bags, because what happens to you happens to us. Your fate is our fate. And they saved their lives. And look at that story. First, it's a Polish family trying to save the Jewish family. Then it's a Jewish family trying to save the Polish family. Then they're trying to save each other. What a beautiful example for all of us to follow. During the Holocaust, a woman is there with her 2 children. The Nazis are closing in on them. The woman says to her children, when the Nazis come, I will try to fend them off, but you run as fast as you can, and don't stop running until the last Nazi has disappeared. That's what happens. The Nazis come. She fends them off for a while. She loses her life. The little girl disappears into the forest. The boy keeps running. And there's one Nazi chasing the boy, and the boy's out of breath. He doesn't know what to do. He remembers his mother's last words, and he keeps running and running and running. And he can no longer breathe. And he sees in the distance a farmhouse, a little hut next to it. He gets to the farmhouse. He jumps into the hut. And no sooner does he do that, does he realize he made a huge mistake, because in the hut there's a vicious black dog beginning to snarl at him. But just a moment later, the dog leaps past him at the Nazi chasing him and barks at him so loudly the Nazi says, this is not worth it for me. The Nazi disappears. The boy is trembling. The dog comes back to the doghouse, doesn't do anything, just looks at him. Hours pass, and then the Polish farmer comes and doesn't see the boy, puts a plate of food in front of the dog. The dog will not eat it, and the boy's starving, and it scraps on the table, so it's edible food. Finally, the boy can no longer resist, takes his plate of food, eats half of it, gives the other half to the dog, and the dog eats it. This goes on for weeks. Every day the Polish farmer comes, doesn't see the boy, puts a plate of food in front of the dog waits until the boy eats first. And they always say, I had a wonderful dog named Mickey, a Labrador Retriever. As much as I loved him, he would gloriously have failed this test, but that's another story. One day, The Polish farmer discovers the boy. The Polish farmer has two choices: take him into the house, save his life, or give him up to the Nazis, which means sure death. And you know what? The Polish farmer does neither. He does neither. You see, he was too cowardly to bring him to the house. I shouldn't say cowardly, too afraid, because how many of us would have done that? But he was too good to give him up to the Nazis. So you know what he did? He made believe he didn't see the boy. But the boy knows he saw him. Do you know why? Because their eyes locked. And you know when someone can see you. And secondly, the next day, the farmer brings out a second plate of food for the dog. And again, the dog shares the food as well and doesn't eat until the boy eats the other plate of food. And this goes on for weeks and weeks and weeks. And then the Polish winter comes, bitter cold, and the boy is dressed in rags, and the dog instinctively nuzzles up to him and protects him from the bitter wind. And then one day, the war's over. The boy moves to Israel. He writes down the story. And the ending of the story is the words that David Silberklein, my professor at Yad Vashem, taught me. He ends the story with the following words: and maybe someday, the rest of humanity will rise to the level of that four-legged animal. Maybe someday, the rest of humanity will rise to the level of that four-legged animal. So for most of this presentation, I've been talking about stories of the righteous among the nations who have been saving Jews during the Holocaust. I want to tell you one last story, which is both about Jewish people and non-Jewish people doing the right thing in a specific situation. Now, I will say part of the story is midrash, which is folkloric imagination, device created by the rabbis thousands of years ago. And part of the story is actual history. It actually happened at a specific place at a specific time. So the first part of the story and the last part of the story is creative imagination, but the middle part of the story is actual historical fact. And the story is taken from the book of Conan by Theo Richmond. And I will begin the story with the imaginative part, end with the imaginative part, and the middle part will be the historical part. During the Holocaust, the angels come to God. They say, God, you must destroy the world. You destroyed the generation of the flood. You destroyed the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah because they're evil. Well, humanity is evil again, even at levels you couldn't even imagine. And God looks down upon the world and sees Treblinka and Majdanek and Belzec and Sobibor and Chelmno and Auschwitz-Birkenau, and he says, look what they're doing to my children. And God is just about to destroy the world when the following scene unfolds in Auschwitz-Birkenau. Lola Birnbaum from the town of Conan had arrived in Auschwitz-Birkenau and were separated from her son Isaac. And as far as she knew, her son had perished. And then one day, she finds out he's alive in the men's camp. And she takes her most precious possession, which was a daily ration of bread, which people fought over, which people dreamed about, it's all they thought about every day. Elie Wiesel said in the camps, we weren't people, we were just stomachs walking on feet. And she takes that precious slice of bread and gives it to her couple and says, please, please, take this slice of bread and give it to my son. Make sure it gets to the men's camp. And does it make it to the men's camp? Yes, it does, because the next day the slice of bread came back with a note from her son Isaac saying, Mother, I love you, but you need this bread just as much as I do. Signed, her son Isaac. And just then, God looked down upon the world and saw the slice of bread being handed from prisoner to prisoner, from Jew to Gentile, all the way across, from the women's camp to the men's camp, all the way back, and nobody, even people who were starving to death, would steal that piece of bread because of the love of a mother for a child and a child for his mother, which they did not want to violate. And just then God said, you know what? I will not destroy the world, because even in a place like Auschwitz-Birkenau, there's still goodness, there's still decency, there's humanity left. It is for their sake I will not destroy the world. And that story is called the slice of bread that saved the world. The slice of bread that saved the world. And I want to give credit to my teacher, Alec Geltzer, alav shalom, who's the one that first shared that story with me. So I want to conclude with two quotes. One quote I've used before in other lectures, but it's definitely worth listening to. The first quote is from Dr. Naomi Azraeli, who once said, nobody survived the Holocaust without the help of another. Nobody. It could have been a hiding place. It could have been a pair of shoes. It could have been a slice of bread. It could even have been a smile. It could have been a kind glance. Primo Levi tells a story about the time he was in a camp and he was so despondent. He wanted to commit suicide. He wanted to go to the barbed wire and touch it. And all of a sudden, one of the German guards, who was not a Nazi, who just happened to be a civilian, looks at him with compassion in his eyes. And that moment of compassion, that moment of empathy, of fellow feeling, gave him hope again. Nobody survived the Holocaust without the help of another. And so we remember this tragic history of the Holocaust, also remember these shining examples of humanity, dignity, and kindness. And the second thing to remember is that the righteous among the nations did not just save Jewish life during the Holocaust, they saved the very reputation of humanity. And I thank God every day that we have these examples to study from that illuminate our lives and inspire us to do better with our own lives. Thank you.